how do you negotiate interest, maybe conflicting interests? How do you run a space in a way that is not hierarchical, that is not dominated by what subsidy givers want or what the free market logic wants, but by what the people who own this space want themselves? And of course there are a number of ways in which you can organize this, in which you can organize a community, in which you can organize ways of decision making. One of which is, as we are wont to do, for instance in the Netherlands, that we use our democratic right to vote once every 4 years for a political party that promises to uphold my interests. Only, of course, to at least partly relinquish those interests in the process of negotiation and interaction with different interests. But there's another element to this voting idea, once every 4 years, that might be problematic for some. That is that if there's 51% of people who want something, then the 49% that is left is basically not heard, one could say. Right? In many voting systems, the idea is that if you vote and a majority wants something, then that somehow stands for what is best for the whole of society. Which, well, you can see in the Netherlands right now, might not always be the case. Well, on the contrary, we see in the last couple of years that a lot of protest movements have basically attacked the way in which democracies function, the way in which governments interact with, for instance, financial crises. Bless you. And one of the ways in which they've done this, and the Occupy protests are just one example of this, is by countering this idea of alienation that your vote is only partly expresses your interest. Is by countering this by, for instance, in front of the stock exchange in Amsterdam, by constructing a community and by making decisions on a consensus basis. And this consensus model, right in front of the stock exchange, which for many people is the epitome of a sort of non-democratic, distant institute of alienation. To erect a sort of community run by consensus in front of this stock exchange is clearly a provocative gesture. In front of an institution that is perceived by many as anti-democratic or as problematic, to say the least, you erect a sort of form of community in which everybody participates in the decision. A consensus model, you have different forms about which we perhaps we'll start talking a little bit, but what they have in common is that every member of the community participates in the decision making. In Occupy Amsterdam, and the two speakers will explain a little bit more about this process. But decisions were made with full consensus. That means that everybody present, say we are here, we need to make a problematic decision. We discuss, we negotiate until everybody agrees with an outcome. And the idea of that is in my opinion, so profound that everybody participates in a discussion. Everybody participates in a decision. Right? That it's on the one hand, it gives a lot of hope, a lot of possibilities to engage people, to invite people to become part of decisions that appeal to them or that are important to them. But on the other hand, there are also challenges or risks or downsides to this model. For instance, that everybody needs to participate in a public arena like this. That can also be a challenge for people who are, for instance, afraid of speaking in public, or of people who feel like they don't have the rhetorical capacities to stand up against what everybody else is perceived to want. So there are basic advantages and there are also downsides to this model. But at this moment in time, it is a very interesting model. It is a very a model that you can see that is being reused, that is being restaged, and is being put forward as a form of protest and, according to some, even as an alternative to current dominant modes of decision making. And also in the mains, we suggest with these 114 people to make the decisions on the basis of consensus. So really down to the practical things, what that means is that, for instance, if someone who pays 150,000 euros and someone who pays 10 euros are part of a community, everybody has the same vote. Everybody, here we go already, the lingo of voting, but everybody has the same contribution to the process of decision making. So it's a sort of egalitarian way of decision making, which everybody who is part of the community has an equal say in what's going to happen. And it's a part of decision making in which if one person doesn't feel all right with the decision, then the decision will not be made. Right? That means that, imagine us being a community having to decide about what we want to do with this building. That means that any one of you can block whatever happens at any time. And just to illustrate the challenges that thinking about consensus democracy brings, when we explain this project, when people come in here and say, well, what are you going to do with this building? Many times we've had the question, what, you want to make decisions with hundreds of people? That's never going to work. Right? It's absolutely never going to work. You're not going to get to anything. And why not? In this sort of critical question, what is implied there? It is implied that people have their own private interests. Private interests conflict sometimes, and people are more attached to their private interests than they are to the common good. And in many of these critical questions, they say, well, it's impossible to make decisions with that many people, implies a sort of attitude and even an image of mankind. Right? That a human being, when he's part of the decision-making process, will try to get his own desires, and if something happens that conflicts his desires, he'll say, no, fuck that, that's not part of my desires. This idea is called, in its philosophical form, the tragedy of the commons. And it describes what happens in commonly owned land. And the classical example is a field. Right? You have a field, say we are villagers, we are part of a very small village, we have a field outside of our village that we all can use freely. According to the tragedy of the commons, what's going to happen then is that everybody is going to put as many of their cows as possible on that field, because that's in their own interest. And because if I don't put all my cows in there, then Helene will, so she'll get her own private interest and I won't. Right? The result of which is that both Helene and me will get as many of our cows as possible on this commonly owned land. These cows will graze all the grass that's there. You end up with a toxic field full of manure. The commonly held owned area is gone to shit. Right? And the solution that the tragedy of the commons offers is that we should get these commonly held areas, we should get them out of our system. We shouldn't think about property in a commonly owned manner. Now instead we should divide it up into either private property, so we fence up my little piece of the commonly held land, I put my cows in there and I take private care of it, because it's in my own interest to take care of this piece of land. Or it should become state property with a guy with a uniform in front of a fence who counts the cows that go in and go out and then regulates it so that the commonly held land will be, or the state-owned land in this case, will be able to subsist forever. So the tragedy of the commons states people are not capable of negotiating their own private interest out of the name of a common good. You need stimulus of private interest or a guy with a stick in a uniform in order to counter people's private interests. This idea of the tragedy of the commons is perhaps, and in case that's my opinion and of a number of people here, this is one of the biggest challenges now in our current society. To overcome this idea that people can only chase after their own private interest and they should be curbed, they should be limited by a state that prevents these private interests from becoming dictatorial. The recently deceased Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom made basically her whole career into proving that the tragedy of the commons is not correct. And that if we only believe in the tragedy of the commons, then things will go wrong. And you can look at examples of the sea, current examples of the commons, the sea, the ocean, or air, both of which belong to no one, but it's all of our responsibility. And she says, here you see the prime necessity to think through of commonly owned stuff like land, like sea, like air, and to stimulate people of taking responsibility for it themselves and stimulating them to negotiate it collectively and to basically, in some places, relinquish your own interests out of the name of some sort of a shared ideal. And that's also why I think the consensus democracy is such an interesting topic to discuss now, because it appeals to precisely that. You see, it appeals to precisely negotiating your own private interest and not being able to take any decisions unless everybody agrees. That's something radically different than voting, which, if you put it provocatively, is based on private interest. I express my private interest. These parties are my interest groups, and they negotiate with each other, and you get a sort of grey compromise, which is the status quo nowadays. I think there's an important difference with consensus democracy, but hopefully we'll talk about that today. And we're very happy to have two speakers here who have had experience with consensus democracy in practice. So we have Helene Scholes, who has had experience as a moderator at the Occupy Amsterdam protest.
Yeah, a participant.
Yeah, participant. And Irache Gayo, did I pronounce that correctly, who will also discuss and place the consensus democracy in a sort of a larger, also international framework.
Ernst has asked me to share just a little bit about my experience with consensus decision making, which has been mostly in Occupy Amsterdam. I don't have any, I guess, big conclusions or anything, but just some experiences and perhaps questions that have come up that I would like to share and perhaps talk through with you guys. And actually the process of trying to formulate a vision together and negotiate decisions together was how I got involved with Occupy Amsterdam. Because when the camp started in Beursplein, and I started to kind of just come there and see what was going on and see how I might perhaps position myself within that. That was what immediately attracted me. And this is actually what I then started to want to contribute to, because I thought it was such a revolutionary thing, this idea that, look, we want to create a space where everyone's contribution is welcome, and where we make it possible for everyone to make that contribution. I thought that was so amazing and so worthwhile that I really wanted to see what I could do to support that. So that's why I started with the moderating the assembly together with a big group of other people. And in some ways, it's exactly like you said. In some ways, I think we really perhaps made some progress and also had some really beautiful experiences where we actually managed to make decisions together that everybody was happy with, and also that everybody could feel they had been able to really participate in and have their say about. And at the same time, it was just really difficult as well, because we often made decisions that then nobody carried out. We're going to do this and that, and sometimes really ambitious. And then in the end, there weren't enough people to really follow through with that. So often within the assembly or the consensus decision making, I would kind of realize often afterwards, unfortunately, like, oh, actually what we're trying to do is kind of control each other and make sure that that everybody knows exactly what's going on, and I guess looking back, it would have been really good if we would have put more time into really exploring the issues through and through and through. And for example, if we wanted to write up a statement together, to not try and do that within 3 days or 5 assemblies, but perhaps take, why not, a couple months for that? Because in the end, we do have that time if we take that time, and the process is, for me at least, half of what makes it so worthwhile. So in that sense, I guess we were sometimes a little bit hasty or too ambitious. And also sometimes we tried to make decisions together about things where it wasn't actually necessary to make a joint decision. If somebody just informs other people, look, I'm enthusiastic about this, I'm trying to pursue this project, your feedback is welcome, then oftentimes they can, I guess, just do that and get all the support that they can get from the people who are there, without those people then trying to decide if it's all right if they follow through with that project. So one of the things that I have been trying to learn during the process is to see where it's really necessary to try and get a consensus decision on something, and where it's more worthwhile to just try and see how we can support each other.
Could you perhaps shortly, for those of you, for those of us who haven't participated in Occupy or haven't been present at the General Assembly, shortly describe how, like, real practically, how it goes?
Sure. Yeah. So, for example, there were decisions about kind of our vision and kind of political issues, but then there were lots and lots of discussions also about kind of practical issues that in their own sense are political in a way, right? About how we were going to manage this whole camp that we had. For example, how we were going to make sure that sometimes simple things, like where are we going to put these tents in such a way that it's going to be safe, but everybody can use them, and then what we would try to do is there would be work groups who would perhaps work on that issue and try and find out and talk to other people what might be a good solution. They would present that to the General Assembly, which is kind of the decision-making body where everybody can participate. And that would be on Beursplein, so on this square, and it's open, everybody passers-by can join. And so what the moderator would do, so me in my role of moderator, is just kind of trying to make sure that the issue gets structured a little and that somebody can perhaps introduce it. So this is about the white tent. Where are we going to put this white tent? Are we going to put it here? Are we going to put it over there? There's pros and cons. And we think the best way is to do it this way, and we can do it tomorrow, for example. And then people would have different contributions to that topic, right? For example, no, tomorrow is not all right, because actually I know that there's a lot of people who have some other plan about this, and then there would be a whole conversation about how you can best do it. And the idea is that in the end, everybody agrees, which doesn't mean that everybody thinks this is a great plan or even the best plan, but at least that everybody can live with it. That everybody says, all right, if we do this, it won't make me want to stop participating in what we're doing here together, and I think it's probably best for the group, even if personally perhaps I might have another preference.
And how does a group get to the point of decision? What do you do? You just You don't vote.
No, we don't vote. You hear all the ideas. The moderator will probably try and kind of summarize things or point out where there might be tensions or where there might be issues that perhaps haven't been explored fully. So that hopefully after a while we've kind of talked about the most important issues that are there, and we've heard kind of all the different opinions and the different takes on that. And then hopefully you get to a point where actually you see, all right, so it looks like the general idea is that we should do it this way or that way. And it might perhaps sometimes be easy, everybody agrees, but it might be that there's a couple of people who are just like, no, but I think another way is still better. And then you kind of hear them again and ask them to explain why they have this opinion and what might perhaps be their proposal, and try to kind of work that into the kind of conclusion that we're reaching, so that it will reflect all the different ideas or preferences or worries. And then in the end, what we would do is just kind of summarize the conclusion. So it looks like the conclusion is this and this and this and this, and then it would be a little bit formal. You make sure that you ask, is this clear for everyone? Has everyone understood what this means? And then we'd ask, is there anyone who has an unsurmountable objection against this proposal? And then just really make sure. And there might be somebody, what often would happen actually, people would go like, yeah, me, I think we should also talk about, and then they perhaps talk about something else. So then you feel like, okay, well, that's an important topic too. We might get to that later. Let's for now see who has an unsurmountable objection to this proposal. So that also shows that you have to be so careful to really make sure that everybody understands the procedure and understands what you're talking about. Otherwise, yeah, there's all these exclusion mechanisms that are gonna come into play. Again, you know, the way they always do when people get together. I'm talking about dilemmas. For example, the dilemma of sometimes what has been difficult for us in Occupy Amsterdam is definitely that there's been people who find it really easy to talk in a group and perhaps enjoy talking in a group and will take a lot of time talking, while other people might be shy or, you know, might be much more careful about how much time they're claiming, and then they don't get to talk.
Do you think it's easier in a situation like this to moderate compared to a situation of a whole can?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, I think so, definitely. And I'm thinking that in a way it's definitely different, and I'm thinking perhaps probably also easier to use this kind of process when it's clearer where you're going exactly, and it's kind of more, the topics are perhaps a little bit more confined, because we were trying to find out so many things at the same time, right? About how to organize ourselves, about how to participate in it, how to position ourselves as individuals, how to formulate alternatives or criticisms to the things that we were seeing and that we were worried about. So many things going on at the same time and so many levels. So I guess when you have a little bit more time and when the issues are kind of a little bit clearer, the issues that you want to stick to, that might make it easier, I think. And just really practically, I guess, language to me has been really important, trying to use language that is nonviolent and that is easy to understand, so that people won't be shy, or people will feel that actually they can participate and it is appreciated. And if somebody says something, and perhaps they might say it, you know, in a bit of a confrontative way, for example, how do you rephrase that so that it's clear what their contribution might be to the conversation? Kind of these language skills, I guess, to me have been really important to try and work with.
Yeah, I have a question because, yeah, I know that in the beginning, in the General Assemblies in Occupy, also in Spain in the Indignados, this openness to everyone and this way of taking decisions through consensus is really, really appealing, because everybody is willing to participate. But do you think there is a point where consensus might become a problem because decisions are not taken and people get frustrated and unmotivated? Because you can certain things, certain decisions may be really critical, and you spend maybe weeks talking about something and you don't reach a solution. And yeah, some people say, look, I don't have time to talk again about this same thing where we know the opinions of the others and we don't reach a consensus. So there is a point where this consensus might be actually a problem. How do you think can be this managed? And there is a point where maybe you actually need some kind of rule besides just to everybody that has to agree. Do you think?
Yeah, I think it can definitely be a problem because of what you say, because of people getting frustrated and tired, or also because sometimes there are circumstances within which you just need to make a decision now, otherwise the decision is going to be taken for you. And I don't have an exact answer to that. Kind of, how do you need to manage that then? It is definitely something to think about. And also it might happen that there's a couple of people who will just, you know, take another position from what the rest of the group wants, kind of regardless. That has happened a couple of times. So then how do you manage that? Often actually what we've found, or what my experience has been in those cases, is that really listening to those people and really taking them seriously in the end has made them come around, because I guess there were so many people who were just really dying to be heard and to, you know, it's just such an amazing thing to be in a big group of people who actually listen to you respectfully. And there's so many people who are so thirsty for that, that I guess we've had a lot of that, of people just wanting to experience that, and then for that reason just saying whatever.
When I'm listening to you speak, I'm all the time thinking also about the text that Sol wrote recently about the concept of growth and how we have been with this the assemblies trying to grow as much as possible, and that we gave so much value to that. But in the end, we also discovered that it's much easier to work in smaller groups, etc. So for me, this this system that we are working on, and on all the failures or the obstacles that we are finding, they are just a matter of maybe collective training and changing, also being able to change the working procedures and finding solutions for that. So if it's not possible to write a text between 1,000 people, obviously you just make smaller groups, and just not everyone has to agree on that, on the outcome, since people can work in smaller groups and build something in smaller groups, no? So I'm thinking that this collective decision making and consensus is actually something that we do every day, all the time. I was driving in the car and thinking about, like, well, this is it, no? Like, I mean, we are deciding together, and now I'm gonna go to the left lane or to the left, and all together we are moving. Sometimes making compromise and letting others, sometimes no. We are negotiating that space. So I think it's something that is much more rooted in our culture than what we think. And just in a little bit bigger scale, and in Basque Country, where I come from, like, my parents live in a village of around 200 people, and they every I don't know, few months they come together and they make decisions together, whether even if there is a mayor who is elected by lottery. So they come together and they make decisions, broad decisions, no? And then it's going to be carried out by this small team. And this process is not necessarily linked to any political ideology, and it's not a communist town, or no, it's not even necessarily progressive. No? They don't see it themselves as that, maybe. So if I think it's when we start speaking about if this can be a model, no, for a bigger political model. I think it is important to look at maybe success stories, no, and also experiments that have been done that are sort of working. Like, for instance, the system of the assembly neighborhoods in Madrid, that is not done in one, the decisions are not made in a huge assembly, but they are made in the neighborhoods, and then they come together once a while, they talk, they inform each other about assemblies inform each other about what their activities are, but the big assembly doesn't have the authority to block any initiative. They just informing each other and asking for collaboration when it's needed. In many different. So, and also the same thing about in the same way with the Cooperativa Integrar Catalana, which is an initiative in Catalonia that is a cooperative of producers and consumers, no? And it's also trying to be some sort of transition model, no, for in between now and a society with no state or no banks, no. So they have their own money, they have their own lawyers team, they have their own health team, no. They have like education, and they help each other, they coordinate each other with that. But they come to the working groups are 20 people, not more. That's, you know, like 10, 20 people, you work there, and then you come together once a month, and it's much easier to also operate, no? So when we speak about if it's too boring, or the decisions don't come to a point ever, and all this stuff, I think it's a matter of training and permanently being critical of the method, so that we can change it. The method is not the aim itself. It's just a tool. But at the same time, it's interesting to think about it as a representation of itself. So that's why it's taking the assemblies have been taking place in public spaces, no? How the fact that they are visible, there also makes them part of a fight for this representation, for this being acknowledged as an agent that can rearrange the hegemonic discourses, no? On how to use public space, on how to look at what is real in politics, etc. So as an assembly at this moment at least has this double function of being a practice and at the same time as a demand. But it's also a part of becoming, no? So at the same time that decisions are being made, a group is also building itself and building an identity that doesn't have to be static nor a frozen one. I would like to read a fragment of the guide for the dynamization of assemblies, or from Take the Square, on how to make the assemblies, the guide for how to make the assemblies, because I think it's a little bit where it's explained also what we mean with consensus. So when faced a decision, the normal response of two people with differing opinions tend to be confrontational. They each defend their opinion with the aim of convincing the opponent until their opinion has won or at most a compromise has been reached. The aim of collective thinking, on the other hand, is to construct. That is to say, two people with differing ideas work together to build something new. Collective thinking is born when we when we understand that all opinions, be these opinions of our own or others, need to be considered when generating consensus, and that an idea, once it has been constructed indirectly, can transform us. So it's in this encounter with disagreement and dissent when consensus model becomes transforming. The aim of the assembly is inclusion, no? So inclusion of these precarious narratives, no? Of narratives that have lost their capability to address anyone in the representative democracies. In Madrid, for example, the Commission of Feminisms, during the camp, they proposed to change the language in the Spanish language. So in Spanish, when you speak on we, you have to define if you're a feminine we or a masculine we. So there was the proposal to change it to the feminine we, and so in a way it caused a lot of controversy, and there's still until now there is discussions about if this is a stupid thing to decide about or not. But many people started adopting this feminine we as a way of also a statement to show how language can dictate who is really speaking, no? So I think it's important to see how this. I mean, the main criticism of this proposal was that it took a particular preoccupation of a collective into the bigger group, and so in an assembly, these individual interests, the particular, become the general cause. So it's not about it's an extreme form of solidarity. No, it's not about how different people can make their aims cohabit with the aims of others, but about how we can an individual project become a group project. So this is a theme that is very contentious in many moments, and when we start speaking about artistic projects, for me, in my experience, it has come all the time. No? After all, a project that is an artistic project initiated by an individual or a collective operating as a unit entails also a particular style or a particular narration, which makes this project very personal. So it doesn't matter if the project in the end is signed or not, or if it's anonymous or not. The question is, how can an art project open itself enough for others to be really part of it? No? And what does this real openness, meaning that others have the possibility of interfering in the fundamental basics of the project, what do this do to quality? So I have to remember also another question that David Graeber posed in an interview recently in Art Forum, in which he explains the project of an artist that they made a big sculpture in one of these demonstrations, and for her is the best project she ever made. And then, but the collective insisted in this in the collective authorship. So, her being a female artist also, isn't this repeating the same structural suppression that this artist lives in a regular institution of art, no? So what is the dilemma for me at this moment is how can we acknowledge at the same time this individual and collective input in a project, in a project, or in a collective decision making. So maybe there is some sort of answer in that they can be like different narratives of the same story at the same time. They can, like there are different ways of looking at something that is one thing, one project.
You mentioned that different narratives can exist at the same time. I think that time is a very interesting definition here. When it comes to decision making and also the notion of authorship, individuality versus the group, I think the reason why Occupy is such an interesting example in Amsterdam or many of the other ones as well is because there was a moment of visibility, as you mentioned, from outside also the Occupy movement. Inside there, people felt that eyes were on them and that there was an urgency to be organized in some way, whichever way that is. That was part of the process. But because it was such a, how would you say, a compact moment in time where all this took place and where these decision makings took place, decisions themselves always seem to be permanent in a way. And I think this is actually the beginning of a mistake, because any process, whether it's communal or an individual reacting to a community of people or a community of thoughts or processes, in the end is always fluid and organic, I think. I believe that any decision that's being made eventually can be altered through the individual opinion of someone else coming after that decision, whether that be a new decision on top of that. This notion of jurisprudence, that when a decision is made there's some sort of finality to it, I think is maybe the beginning of a lot of problems that that stand in the way of actually group processes, that a decision is actually permanent in some way. So what you're saying about two narratives existing next to each other, parallel to each other, I can agree with actually. But I can also agree with the idea that a narrative having taken place a day ago, a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, still has a relationship to a decision or a narrative that suddenly exists because of what we're speaking about here today, or starts to exist tomorrow, a week from now, a year from now. They still relate to each other. It's still, I think, one process. And I think the fear for a lot of people that a decision actually means that something has been made permanent stands in the way of true communal processes.
Like the structure of the model itself, of the consensus model, was it was decided from the very beginning. This was kind of like, maybe it was decided by the ones who started it up somehow and then developed it, and then it became very stiff in its the way it was functioning. And at a certain moment it was really not functioning anymore. It became like a theater piece almost. And then you know that you kind of like need to develop the performative aspect of it. So therefore I agree, then it needs to become like, it needs to, like if a decision then becomes permanent, but if it doesn't function anymore, you need to change it. But it takes often a lot of time, because already took so much time to get there. So that was the tension that was all the time going on. You need to kind of like be open for a new decision, but people were also really happy at a certain moment, like, oh, we finally made a decision, and now let's please stick to this, because there are so many decisions to be made. But I think in that sense the time is really important, and also like reconsidering the contract that you kind of like wrote together over and over again.
And I think also the openness and the multi-layeredness of the decision-making process and the different kind of opinions that arise in different time levels and etc. It's a very kind of vulnerable process, and we should not forget that the whole process was under a severe kind of pressure. It was really, really a pressure cooker almost, with demands not only on the ideology of the movement, what is it about, what was constantly recurring in the media, the question, what are you doing here? We needed to formulate some kind of goal. That was an enormous pressure, but also, of course, practical demands, right? Made it almost necessary to think in really core issues or very rigid, fundamental kind of decisions, because they were really, really practical. So to do this more multi-layered and more time-consuming process, what you also mentioned, like we could take months, but not at the burst plan, not so much under this kind of pressure. So the question is then, how do you create space and time to do this more kind of vulnerable process of group building, right?
This is an interesting connection. Sorry, and to the session that we had 2 weeks ago with Gideon Boye, who at first was kind of reluctant to understand what we were trying to do. Basically, it's like, yeah, but you know, I don't see what the importance is of making these decisions together if you don't have like a clear ideological program, right? And at some point he ended by saying, but maybe it's about time, right? What you do when you create a space like this, many of the problems that Wouter just described aren't there. Imagine if we purchased this space, and in the official documents we say, unless everybody agrees that we want to sell it, it's never going to be sold. That means that you have a space that is, no matter how many budget cuts or market crises will crash down upon us, that means you have a space in which you have time.
If I want to live in a world where certain values are held high, then I want to walk the talk, right? I'm not going to get there through a decision-making process where I can kind of push my ideas onto somebody else. I have to try and engage in this process where we're gonna figure it out and we're not sure where we're gonna get to, but to actually be willing to kind of undertake that journey together with other people, I think is really important. And in Occupy Amsterdam, often there's this kind of yell, right, where you go like, tell me what democracy feels like, and then everybody answers, this is what democracy feels like. We did that sometimes, and I would think, yeah, and it's pretty uncomfortable how it feels. But that's what it is.
Yeah. It's interesting, and there's a number of things that you mentioned, and one of them was this idea that people having a voice or not daring to speak in public or whatever. And there were a couple of things. I was recently at Occupy Berlin, and that had a lot of downsides to it, but it was interesting to see some of the differences within the General Assembly. And one of them was the way of giving everybody present, no matter who they were, a minute and a half to speak. And that meant that people who would normally not stick their finger up and say, I have something to say, were then enabled to say something. Almost everybody used the 1.5 minutes, which was not always a good thing, because often people were saying the same thing as somebody said before them, simply because they had the 1.5 minutes. But it did mean that people who were shy, because this was their allotted time, did take that time to talk. It also meant that people who were normally talking were cut off after 1.5 minutes.
Yeah, the repetition of stereotypes or something like that, the method of consensus democracy doesn't seem to necessarily counter stereotypes or discrimination or sexism or forms of exclusivity. So you would need something extra, right? That's why I think you called it a tool.
Yeah, exactly. For me, I'm all the time coming to this like, yeah, but it's the assembly is just one of the things that has to be done, not the only one. And I think, and also linking to the need for experiment, calling it like some sort of experiment, a time for experiment, where you can revisit what you just decided. I think it's very important because in the end you are deciding like, I don't know, we're going to go demand the banks this and that. And then you go and then you confront the practice that actually nobody listens to you or whatever, you need to change the strategy. So this confrontation with the practice is essential to also revisit the decisions that you made. And this dialogue all the time with the practical experiment, which at the same time in the whole Occupy, I think has been the most difficult part to find out what we have to decide about. That to decide the content. And I'm thinking about also all the time when I hear you speak, and I'm mainly lately with in assemblies of Spanish or expatriates, that we are like, the sense of urgency in Holland is very different, like this time, and then there is in Spain. And then there is so much happening in Spain with this time pressure as well. So in a way, this the context is already creating the content.
I think maybe the issue of interdependency is really important in this, because I was thinking when you were talking about things which I recall of common use. And when I first visited Portugal, which is maybe 12 years ago, a particular valley where we used to come quite often, and you have this system of irrigation which has been going on for years, in which there is a limited amount of water and there is a time arranged at which you can open the mud gateway to your individual field and allow the water to trickle down into your field to water it for a certain amount of time. You then block it back up and your neighbour or somebody else is allowed to remove the mud for the dam to let the water into their patch. And this system had been going on for years and years and years and years. And in the 10 years since, it stopped. It stopped partly because people no longer needed to use their fields in order to grow vegetables. It stopped also because people have been growing eucalyptus and there is no more water to run through the irrigation ditch. But I think really the reason it stopped is because the dependency on each other, the closeness of that community, as Portugal changed, as people got cars, as people no longer were dependent on their neighbours and on the self-built systems in which nobody was able to be greedy and take all the water for themselves, even though they were the first one in the chain. I think when that interdependency broke down, that's the point at which that whole system stopped working. And I think that that's also something which is important within the kind of collectives we're talking about, and the difference between the Beursplain and Berlin, or the difference between the Beursplain and the Maint, is to do with the interdependency of the physical situation and the physical situation of our lives and this, and a kind of stake that you have in the success of the project, which reflects back on your individual life. And I think that that's something that's going to really affect the way in which we look at decision making and the decisions which are taken.
There's a high level of symbolic social capital in what you're saying, and I think you're right. I mean, the fact that the Maint has brought together 114 people, I think for most people involved is more important than the 1.72% that it actually owns this building. Huh?
Yeah.
And if I may put it bluntly, it's a reason that we can fool ourselves that we're going to buy this in the end. I'd like to think we are, by the way, but realistically speaking, we can park that if we like, huh? and not even have to deal with it. But the symbolic capital of actually us coming together 6 times, sitting around a round table, discussing it, and developing some kind of community, a community of dialogue, is obviously worth a lot. Now, at a certain point, there's a good book which I've recommended to Wouter and Elke early on, called The So-Called Utopia of Centre-Bourg, which was written in 1972, and it's about a community that was born in the undergrounds of Paris, underneath the Centre Pompidou, Centre-Bourg Square. And basically the book starts with a wonderful scene. It's a fictive reportage or an account of an experiment in utopia, cultural utopia, finding new ways of cultural coming together. And basically it starts with the man who writes the account, the author. He presents the space. It's 72 floors under the ground. It's Costco. There's an elevator. There's stairs. There's ventilation, and that's it. Nothing else. And he says, "Okay, we built it. We have this much money left. It's yours." And that's it. So disbelief. People are getting angry. They're cynical. They don't understand why. There's a lot of disorganization and confusion. And they argue and they argue and they argue. And at a certain point, one person is wise enough to say, "Look, I don't think we're going to solve this today. But so I recommend we come back tomorrow. But I can't come back and talk about this and discuss this anymore if I can't sit down, because I can't think right if I'm not sitting down discussing it. So I propose that everybody brings a chair tomorrow, and then we can continue this discussion." And actually, that first decision that everybody comes back and brings a chair. Some people get overzealous and they bring a table as well. Some people even brought a cabinet, but everybody brought a chair. And it brought them together again to discuss it. But now they had chairs. So, I mean, the book goes from there, but the idea that it actually does lead to something practical, which goes beyond the social and the social capital, but actually maybe a practical capital that exists. There's maybe a horizon, albeit a very shallow one and very close horizon, but I think that's how I interpret what you're saying, at least, that you need to have some kind of horizon constant. But maybe this one is also relative in terms of what part of the process you're in. Maybe that first horizon has to be so short.
I think the word common already says it. It's what you have in common. And someone needs to repeat it, what you have in common, so that people come together and stay close and discuss together. And finally, I think someone must make an analysis, or you can be moderator, but as a moderator, somehow you are an analyst trying to pick up everything that's said and to come to a decision. Someone must make a conclusion, otherwise you will never have a decision. So there always will be someone in a role of doing that. So first of all, placing the comments, what we have in common, repeating it, because otherwise the people get lost. If they don't, someone says what we all have in common, we're lost. And secondly is when people have told what they had to say, trying to find the right line, making the analysis, being the moderator and saying, okay, if you all agree, our conclusion after the reunion is this. Do you all agree? And then you have a result, I think. I think that's a procedure you find back in most of the structures. Also the people that we saw before in the previous reunions, if you saw when they had a good result, it was more or less because there was this sort of concept behind it. So you can't get around it. The thing is that I think having your say is very important. It's very important for democracy. So there's all kinds of formula, giving 1.5 minutes like they did in Berlin to each of them, so that you can hear at least what everyone has got to say. But then you need to come back to the common, to what all these reactions bring for the common, for the general interest. And then on the general interest, a decision needs to be made. So someone needs to have the role to be the analyst and say, okay, if you all agree, then if we do this, we're going to do this.
Say I'm mentally handicapped, say I'm irrational, say I am crazy, or in whatever way I'm resisting, refusing, or in any other way unable to participate in the decision-making process. How do you go about doing that? For instance, at Bergplein, was caring for people that needed care, was important, but that weren't quite capable of or willing to participate in this quite rational model of consensus making was quite a challenge. And I was just wondering, because we introduced it as well as saying, well, we propose a radically alternative image of what it means to be human, right? And on one hand you have this idea which can be seen to be dominant, private interest and then state curbing our private interest. On the other hand you have a sort of engagement, responsibility and shared ideals. But I was just wondering if you could reflect on it. Isn't there a new model of what it means to be a rational consensus making abled, that you're a human being able of making consensus decisions? Not everybody is capable or willing. of doing that. So how do you go about with people that don't fit the rational idea of sitting around the table, letting you finish and participating in the discussion?
I recognize the dilemmas that you sketch, and I think there's a big risk of constructing the kind of group where you can only really participate if you do that in a certain way, if you can use a certain kind of vocabulary. And I think it's really important to try and have a really critical mind and be really creative as well about what kind of techniques we can use. Should we break up in little groups? We've tried different things. Perhaps, if the atmosphere gets really tense, we might want to take a break. We might want to, see if we sing a song together, which actually helps a lot. Like, what are the different, or can you visualize things? Are there other ways in which you can work through a decision-making process with a group of really diverse people so that everybody in their own way can contribute? So I think on the one hand, it's important to try and explore all those possibilities. And on the other hand, I guess it's, for me, it would be the responsibility of the group to try and make sure that you do everything that you can to see what the contribution of each person might be. And even the person who comes and will kind of just yell and whatever, I don't think you should just accept everything. And there's, you should structure it, and at the same time, there is some need that they have, and there's some reason that they're doing that, and it would be so wonderful if you can kind of get at that and get to a point where you can include that. So on the one hand, I think that's necessary, you have to be dedicated to that, and I think it's possible to work that way, and on the other hand, I would, at the same time, think that if you start a process like this, it's really important to early on talk through these dilemmas and also see, for example, if there is this one person or these two people who just kind of keep having a different point of view, and you find out that as a group you are just not able to work that through, and you've really, really, really tried, okay, is there a point where you're going to say, we have to part ways? I think there are points where you're going to have to say that. And you have to talk about that beforehand, because once you're there, there's too many emotions, I guess, and there's too many interests, and then it's not about, or there's a big risk that it's not just about how you think you should handle things, but it's going to be about personal relations.
What makes us human and not just meat on sticks is this desire to be part of a community of some sort. And if you make this community so appealing that even the asshole neighbour wants to become part of it in the end, then you win, as it were. And that, that's what we have to trust in. Because if we don't trust in that, what's the point of doing it anyway? Really, we have to believe in that in order to continue to put the effort in, I think.
Mm-hmm. I just quickly want to respond to what Hélène said about the creativity of trying to change or alter the way things are shaped, not only in a structural sense from the point of view of the organization, but also in its manifestation, in its form. We're talking about space, we're liberating space through purchase. It's about spatial design, I think, as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always funny to see if you almost automatically how you design these kind of places and spaces, you automatically choose for things that you really know. For example, the round table. It's the cliche of sitting together in a group discussing about communal matters. And I think if we're going to do the assemblies in the main, I would really like it when these issues are addressed of how you transform or design these gatherings.
Mm-hmm.
From the point of view of the organization, but also in spatial design. And maybe that is in a way the vacuum that we created, or the free space, which is detached from almost a practical necessity, which is of course could be addressed as a critique But I see it very much as an advantage point and me as an artist or designer. I like this aspect that we will create a free space and time to be able to question these issues of how you as an entity or community can reshape these collaborative processes through the design and the gatherings. And then you need people from theater and arts and all coming together and sharing these kind of experiences. So I think there will be a big task laying ahead of us, where we can have a lot of different opinions and ideas from all different sectors of life.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite an undertaking.
Yeah, I'm all the time coming to the more than commons, the care. No? But in a way, I read this text about the commons and how it all starts in the home, no? In the domestic environment, and especially in the old house where there are a lot of families who they have to deal with the same space, and it's all about cooking together, and negotiating that common life together, not just the space but also common life. No? Well, how do we create this sense of care or shared space without the space? What if we don't get the space? What if we can't buy the space? We don't reach it, no? But how accessibility doesn't matter so much. But then what is what we are then building? No? How do we create this moment of that we have some sort of common project?
It's just really, I think it is really helpful. It might be a handicap as well, or turn into a handicap. At the same time, it's really helpful to have some kind of point of focus. Mm-hmm. So in a way, having this space is a point of focus, that kind of this lens which can help you then kind of analyze, work through, explore these issues about collective ownership, about how do you invite people to your space. So it's not about this building, but this building is really helpful to us as a group to give us a point of focus where we can explore these issues. And I guess if there wasn't this building, then it might be helpful for us to see if there might be something else that we can use as a focus.
Speaking of spaces, there's all sorts of, it would be good perhaps also to introduce it into this project, like the digital ways of making decisions and consensus democracy, which is also a space. And there's many platforms that are experimenting with that. And for instance, then you can participate. I've heard of one system where you can participate anonymously in discussion, right, which would cut out, for instance, the gender. When women, because they don't have a loud voice, they're not taken seriously, which is one analysis that I've read of the General Assemblies in right? Some voices don't carry louder, so they carry less weight, and they're perceived to be as less important. You cut that out, or the identification. It's a woman, so I'm not listening. Or,
Yeah, about that I was wondering, because if in this space you will need a lot of people to buy the space. No, if you have 1,000 participants, it's physically impossible to have an assembly here. So
it already is.
Yeah, necessarily you will have either to do assemblies by turns, so a group of people makes the assembly and takes the decision, for instance, if you really want to be in the space, or most probably you will create some kind of virtual space where everybody can actually have an assembly, because 1,000 people assembly here is impossible. You really, if you really want that the 1,000 people have a say, you need a virtual space, especially the guy from Canada. So how are you going to manage this? Because probably the virtual space will become more important than the physical space. And yeah, about that there is, as you said, there are a lot of experiences, especially in Spain, because the assemblies were really big and very quick. People shift towards the virtual communication or through internet. And yeah, there are a lot of possibilities actually. I know there is people in Seville, they are creating actually a software, because yeah, the idea is that 1,000 people speak together at the same hour at the same time, but to organize this is impossible, or almost impossible. So what people can do is, okay, you have to talk about the topic, and each person has an opinion, no? And he can write it down. I think this and this and this and that, and the software will read all the opinions of everyone and will compound a text with the opinion of everyone. Automatically. Yes, taking the words that are more used, the sentences that are more used, and they're working on this.
And I've been thinking about anonymity and the fact that for me it engenders the possibility to behave badly more than it engenders the possibility to behave well. Because if one behaves badly but one is anonymous, nobody is going to punish you as part of the community. And that's why, for me, thinking of the fact that you talk about a village in Basland, and I was thinking about my mother's village, which is a conservative village. I mean, their member of parliament is David Cameron. That's the village it is. And yet, within this village, there are various decisions which are made about a piece of common land, to keep it as common land, not to build on it, to exploit it to make money, which are inherently socialist or in terms of the common good. But it's partly because, although the village is not tiny, there's still a sense that people know who you are, and therefore to promote an idea which would be bad for the common good would entail some kind of exclusion or some kind of attitude towards you which you don't want to risk, and therefore the sense of belonging to the community is really important, and the size of the village is important to that. And that's why it's interesting to see at what level this stops functioning. I mean, this functions because of the size of the village, but at what moment do we become anonymous and therefore able to behave badly, as it were? I mean, for me, anonymity doesn't entail necessarily an improvement.